Go back to the agenda of the conference, and I'd like to introduce to you our first speaker of the day, and that's Jim Fogarty, a landscape architect and a winner of multiple awards. He comes from Melbourne. He is a former president of the gardening media of Australia.
Spasiba.
Thank you.
It's the only word I know. My name's Jim, and I've come all the way from Melbourne, Australia, so it's a big honour for me to be here talking to you this morning. And what I'm going to talk about is anti-globalism in garden design, and it's something I'm quite passionate about because where I'm from in Australia, because of Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, garden design is very influenced by designers from other countries. But I think we should preserve independence and integrity and our own culture of our own countries in our own style of creating gardens. So back home with my work, I'm trying to do a lot of stuff with working with Australian plants, telling Australian stories through garden design, talking about our geography, the colours of our landscape, the shapes of our landscape. Australia's a very big country. We have snow, we have deserts, we have rainforests, and we have beautiful white sandy beaches. So it's nice, I think, to tell the stories about that through garden design. But the other thing that I get worried about is the concept of cultural cringe. And that's, for instance, in Australia, our European history is only about 250 years, which is quite young. And yet our Indigenous history is 60,000 plus years old. Now, the interesting thing in Australia is since European settlement, we've looked to the English, the Italians, the French as inspiration for garden design, and there's nothing wrong with that because they create beautiful gardens. But I think we need to create our own sense of identity, so that's something I want to talk about today. The other thing we've had recently, and you may have heard about this, is very bad bushfires. Now, bushfires are very much part of the ecological cycle of plant life in Australia, but the problem is a lot of people like to live in the forests, in the national parks. They like to appreciate the beauty of the wilderness. But when there's bad fires, you get a lot of houses burnt down, and sadly people die from it. So these are some of the photos I just got off the internet showing some of the devastation. But the big thing this year with the fires has been the appreciation for the destruction of fauna, of the birds. You can see here a flock of black cockatoos. A lot of the forests have been decimated, and because of that, the food source for a lot of the bird life has also gone. So it's very important that when landscape architects or landscape designers are creating new gardens, that we're also thinking about providing a food source for the birds. And also koala bears. Can everyone see that photo there? This is quite a famous photo now of the koalas being rescued because so many koalas have died in the bushfires, and it's very, very tragic. This is a very famous photo, and you can see there's a lady who's taken her shirt off to rescue a koala. After this photo was taken, there was another koala that needed rescuing, but I'm not allowed to show the photo of that one, it's a bit rude. Sorry. Anyway, so going back 9 years, and what I was talking about with telling stories about our country. This is a garden I designed, and I was telling the story about bushfires. This was actually in Japan, in Nagasaki, 2011, and it was all Australian plants. And the idea was that the garden lit up at night looked like a fire burning in the middle of the bush. Okay, so it told the story about the bushfires. And the thing with bushfires in Australia is it's the change of wind direction that causes a lot of problems because people don't foresee that the fire will all of a sudden change direction and then it will wipe out a whole town and kill a lot of people. So that's what this garden set out to try and tell the story about the fires. And as I say, using all Australian plants like this little one here that attracts a lot of bees and butterflies as well. The plants on the right there, I won't go into too many details of plant names because I know it's difficult for the translators. But I think someone had a photo of Sir Joseph Banks up yesterday, I think. Was it Alessandro or someone? I saw a photo of Sir Joseph Banks. And this plant here is a Banksia. And you can see the flowers on that is a major source of nectar for birds in Australia. So planting plants like the Banksia is very, very important. So that's the garden. This was, as I say, it was in Japan, but it was an Australian garden. And that was at the Gardening World Cup in 2011. The same year I did the Chelsea Flower Show in London, and of course I'm sure you've all heard of the Chelsea Flower Show. And the idea of this garden was to promote the new Australian garden, the Botanic Garden, southeast of Melbourne. It was called the Australian Garden. And I was looking again at things like Indigenous art, Australian Aboriginal artwork on the top left here, which features mainly symbols like the campsite or waterhole, the hunting boomerang. And this was actually a photograph of the Qantas airline uniform, which features the same symbols on the fabrics. And elements like Uluru, bottom left, the very iconic big rock in the central part of Australia. And so I created this garden that told the story about the different regions of Australia, geography from the outback arid areas, the coastal areas, the more temperate places, and the gorges. And it was all about the journey of water from the outback arid areas to the coastline of Australia. So you can see here, this is the outback part of the garden with the outback wildflowers. We have the ephemeral salt sculptures there. Of course, all the Australian plants. And the Australian plants are quite diverse. A lot of flower colours and often a lot of very strong colours like reds, yellows, oranges, which are quite hard to work with in design. But the strong colours do provide opportunities for creating quite bold colour schemes. And this part of the garden was where the water metaphorically flows to the east coast of Australia. So we had more coastal plantings in this part of the garden. And some of the details in the garden. So the thing I was trying to exhibit with this garden was that rather than relying on formality of, say, Italian gardens, because a lot of people in Melbourne are very influenced by formal gardens in Europe, that this garden had more curvaceous natural shapes, symbolising nature. And then the pavilion up the back of the garden here, which featured, see the light fitting in the pavilion was made from recycled fencing wire from cattle stations in the outback parts of Australia. And that's the finished garden. So that was Chelsea Flower Show in 2011. And then I had the opportunity to do Hampton Court Palace Flower Show in 2014. And because I was working for sponsors that were involved in tourism with airlines and travel companies, and they were trying to encourage more Europeans to come to Australia to experience our culture and travel around Australia and drink wine and eat our food and things like that. But I came across this great Dreamtime story. Dreamtime is part of the culture of Australian Indigenous Aborigines. And there was a story about the Rainbow Serpent. And the Rainbow Serpent lives underground. And when the Rainbow Serpent is stirred up and becomes angry, it creates the mountain ranges and the gorges. And also you get the black clouds come in the sky, and you get the very heavy rains and the storms. And of course, with the rain in the outback, you get abundance of wildflowers that pop up seasonally. So I thought there was a great connection between this great Dreamtime story of the Rainbow Serpent and Australian plants. So I came up with this design, and this garden was intended to be designed in a sustainable way. So the whole thing could be recycled at the end of the show. All the plants were donated to Kew Gardens in England, and they're now in the glass house at Kew Gardens. And all the rocks went back to the rock yard, and we used a lot of recycled bricks and terracotta tiles to get the outback red sand in the garden. Now, the other thing I did with this garden is, so this was 2014, Instagram was becoming quite big. Social media is playing a bigger role with marketing of gardens because, of course, a lot of garden designers and landscape architects understand the commercial reality of doing gardens, sometimes in public spaces, is all about marketing and promotion for stakeholders and sponsors. So I came up with the idea of integrating social media marketing campaign to help promote the garden for the sponsors. And we used technology from the University of Lincoln, which enabled us, using the hashtag Essence of Oz, which was the name of the garden, so that every time someone tweeted with that hashtag, it would trigger the pumps in the water feature that would turn on and agitate the water to bring to life the story of this rainbow serpent, the Dreamtime story. So you can see here all the plumbing for the water feature. Oh, thank you. I haven't finished yet though. But the other part of it is I wanted to recreate Australian creek water. So the photo on the top right is a creek just near my office. And one day I walked down the creek and I used my phone with an app and I took photos, many photos of the creek water. And then I got the colour code of the photo. It's like a colour grab app on the phone. And then from that, the colour code, I was able to translate to get to red, green, blue paint tint to recreate the muddy creek water using a little bit of acrylic paint in a bucket. Can you see on the bottom left there? Yep. So this is just fake water, basically, to recreate the creek water. So you can see the finished product, yep. So the water, you can see the water is agitating a little bit there. So every time someone tweeted Essence of Oz, it would trigger the pumps and turn and start stirring up the water to bring to life the story of the Rainbow Serpent. So that was Hampton Court 2014. That garden actually won the Tudor Rose Award. So if you ever come to Melbourne and see me, which I'm sure you will, and you visit the Australian Garden at Cranbourne, the actual Tudor Rose Award is on display there. So again, you can see lots of different shapes in the garden, and you can see the outback red sand. It's a very strong colour using red sand, and it's not something I use with clients' gardens, but for a show garden like this, it's a great way of educating people, especially from other countries, about some of our plant life. And that's the actual head of the Rainbow Serpents. The idea was the deck came out from the pavilion, and that symbolised the Rainbow Serpent, and that's the head of the serpent with the eye of the serpent as well. The plant on the right is kangaroo paw. I'm sure you're probably quite familiar. Do you know it? Kangaroo paw? Yeah? Is that well known in Russia or not? A little bit? Yeah. Now, so when I did this show at Hampton Court, this guy here, Charlie Solomon, Charlie's from the Monaro tribe. And the Monaro tribe, their land is actually where the fires have been, in between Canberra and over the border into Victoria. And Charlie came to do the smoking ceremony at Hampton Court. And Charlie's a youngish guy like myself, quite sprightly. And but Charlie was really just very enthralled by this garden because, as I say, his culture extends 60,000+ years. For him to see an interpretation of a Dreamtime story designed as a garden and retelling that story to a whole new generation of people, he thought was a fantastic idea. And he got right behind it. And because of that, I've started getting involved in doing more cultural designs, so depicting stories about Indigenous culture. But of course, to do that, you've got to have a lot of protocols in place. So teaming up and partnering with Charlie has enabled me to take on some projects where we are using or referencing ancient dialogue in garden design. So it's bringing the concept of culture back into horticulture. Now this is a property, it's like a beach house. I suppose you don't have beach houses in Russia, really, do you, in Moscow? But like a weekend holiday house or something. Yeah, is the translator doing a good job here? Yep. So it's our own house, okay? So we had quite a small budget, because I'm a garden designer, I'm not very wealthy. But I thought because it's our own garden, it was a chance to do something a little bit different, and a chance to test the water of retelling Indigenous dialogue through garden design. And I looked at a lot of Indigenous art that depicts moving water, because this property was actually a designated flood zone site. So it was actually a very difficult place to build a garden, because from say June till November, which is winter, till late spring, the garden is flooded. It's completely saturated. And then from summer through till early winter, it's completely dry, and the ground cracks, and it goes like concrete. So it's very, very difficult to plant a garden and get plants growing in this kind of environment. So I wanted to tell a story in the design of the garden about the concept of moving water. So I looked at Indigenous art, and I looked at symbols of moving water and water holes, and then created this design so that the grass became the water moving across the landscape, and then the water drips out the driveway. The other thing about this design was that we have what's called setbacks. So a lot of houses are set back maybe 9 metres from the front boundary, but I wanted to set the house right at the back of the property. It's only a small house. People were concerned, firstly, because the house was small, but what's wrong with that when you can have a bigger garden? And secondly, because we set the house back, they didn't understand that. They thought the house should be up the front, but I was like, no, but we want garden. We want the garden to be the street appeal, not the building. We wanted to change the mentality. Instead of the architect being in control, the garden was in control. So we had a prefabricated house put on the site, you can see here. So it was built off site, and because it was a flood zone, it was very difficult to build on site. I know I'm standing in everyone's way, I'm sorry. I wanted to get the turf down very quickly as summer came on, because we needed to establish the grass. This is a drought-tolerant turf, so we've got no irrigation in this garden at all. Okay, so early stage of the garden, you can see the shape starting to come together. So the grass, you've got a picture, is symbolising the water moving across the landscape. I've got a soakage pit or water hole in the corner there. And it was my daughter who said to me, she was only probably 6 at the time, but she's more intelligent than I am. And she said, "Dad, could that be a sandpit to play in?" And I said, "Of course it could be, that's perfect." So in winter I thought it might flood, but in summer they can use that as a sandpit. And of course, perfectly worked, because I knew that there was a wet spot in that garden. And you can see when the rain starts to come, the soakage pit fills with water. I then designed a deck for the front of the house. And a big thing in Australia is, in the last 25 years, Australians have been using imported hardwood rainforest timber from places like Malaysia, the Philippines, New Guinea, for a lot of decking and screens and garden construction. Now, that's obviously a very bad thing, because it destroys a lot of habitat for orangutans. One of the very popular woods that we use in construction is murbu, and that's the tree that orangutans live in. So I'm quite passionate in advocating to stop using those sort of timbers in Australia, And I designed a deck and pergola shade structure using an iron bark, which is actually denser than merbau. It's a harder wood, and it lives a lot longer, and it's a beautiful Australian hardwood. So you can see the hardwood deck there when it was finished. And then as the garden starts to grow. So you've got to remember, this garden for 6 months of the year is completely sodden. And then the other 6 months, 6 plus 6 equals 12, it's completely dry like concrete. Got no irrigation at all. Okay? So the plants have to survive extended periods of waterlogging and then extended periods of drought. So it's very, very difficult and challenging. You can see the waterlogging here. Okay? You can see in the photo here how wet the soil is. So many plants drown in those sort of conditions. This is another Banksia you can see here. And it's been amazing. It's probably the hardest site I've ever worked on. But it's been very interesting for me to see and push to see the limits of what some of these plants can tolerate as far as waterlogging and then drought on the other hand. See the soakage pit? Yeah. So that's 6 months of the year, it's that wet. So it's taken, the garden's about 4.5 years old now. It's taken quite a while to get the plants growing. You can see here the driveway in the foreground. The other problem I find with designing gardens in Australia is that driveways take up a disproportionate amount of space in gardens. They're often quite big, and there's a lot of land value locked up in driveways. So I like to try and integrate plants where possible in a driveway, so the driveway looks like it's part of the garden, not just an extension of the property. So the plants are starting to grow. You can see the shapes coming together a bit now. And then in summer, it dries out. The soakage pit empties out. And these plants here, this is a plant called, I'll give you the common name so it's not too difficult, fanflower. And it flowers from late spring right through till autumn. So it's a long flowering period. But the bees, especially bees, absolutely love this plant. So again, it's not just thinking about birds, but also things like bees is a big issue with creating gardens. So providing a food source for bees is very, very important. You can see the garden coming together. So we've got a campfire spot. So we actually, we can stand around the fire pit and have a drink. We can also cook on that fire pit. Or it's just even an aesthetic element in the garden, telling the story about campfires and waterholes. So this photo is probably, I think, last summer. So quite established. As I say, it's got absolutely no irrigation. And the other thing I did in this garden, because it's my own garden, is that I didn't mulch it. So I wanted to try some other theories. And I didn't mulch it because I wanted to save money, on one hand. But also, I thought because the site had never been built on, if I mulched it, there's two issues. One is that a lot of mulch comes with weed seed, and then the weeds get out of control, and that's not a good thing. Secondly, because the site had never been built on, I wanted to see whether any remnant vegetation would come back up. Now that I was looking after the garden and managing it, I wanted to see if any old plants came back through, and they have. And it's amazing, you know, to think these plants have been there for thousands of years, and all of a sudden I'm allowing them to come back through and grow on. So it's been very exciting. So all these plants are Australian plants, and I've tried to use as many local plants to that area as possible. You can see even using some shape in the hill of the lawn there. And that's the driveway. See the driveway? So it's quite floriferous. There's a bit of colour going on. Can you see? And this is the front driveway here. This is another Banksia here. See, the Banksia flowers are quite big and strong. And that's a swamp Banksia, which grows in very wet conditions. Yeah, so that's our little holiday house. It's a lot of fun though. But the thing I find is that when I'm out in the garden, a lot of people stop and chat to me and they want to learn about Australian plants. And they think it's a little golf course design. So when I explain the background to it about the Indigenous dialogue, the story of moving water, they find it absolutely fascinating, because no one's ever really done that in Australia. I mean, I'm sure people have, but no one's really taken the concept of linking with the Indigenous community and retelling very old, ancient stories through garden design. And to me, I find that very exciting. And there's another view through to the soakage pit. And I rake the sand pit a bit, just for a bit of fun in summer. So just showing a couple of key plants, and I was talking about providing habitat for birds. So it's one thing after these fires in Australia that people are now really aware of, is the importance of providing a food source for birds. So some of these plants like this Banksia, this is actually a Banksia from Western Australia, but it grows in heavy soils, so it's perfect for this site. But the flowers would be more than 30 centimetres tall, yeah, more than 1 foot. So they're very big, very, very showy, attractive flowers. And you can also get a claret colour form of it too. So they're quite woody shrubs, a lot of these plants, because they can take the weight of birds perching and feeding on them. There's the Banksia primorsa, the yellow form there. The other thing I just want to talk a little bit about today is understanding some of the cultural use of some of the plants. So for instance, plants like the Banksias and also Grevillea, which is another genus of Australian plant, were traditionally used to sweeten water. So it's kind of like a mixer or a cordial or something. So the nectar actually sweetens the water for drinking. This is a Grevillea peaches and cream. It's a very pretty Grevillea. Can you see the colours? It's like peaches and cream, as the name says. This tree is very interesting. This is a tree local to the area. So this is southeast of Melbourne, in a coastal area on the Mornington Peninsula. Now this tree here, if you rip the leaves off and you rub them very quickly underwater, it starts lathering into a soap, just straight from the leaves of the tree. It's incredible. And also the other thing is tea. The ability to make tea with Australian plants, because everyone just assumes that tea comes from Camellia sinensis. There are other plants you can make tea from, and a lot of people in Australia don't even realise this. Here's a very well-known one. It's lemon myrtle, which makes a sort of citrusy type tea. You just pick the leaves, put it straight in the hot water. Another one, this is a coastal plant. It's called coria. This also makes tea. And the flavour of this one's a bit spicier. It's very interesting. And another one is, this is called native sarsaparilla. I'm sorry if the plant names are difficult. But this one makes a tea that's very similar to green tea. But again, it's an Australian plant and has been used for tea for thousands of years. This is another plant, Lomandra longifolia. It's a strappy tufting plant and has a lot of cultural uses. You can eat the base of the stems. It's a little bit like, sort of like a celery or something. You can weave baskets and make string. The roots were used to treat bites and stings. You can make flour from the seeds, and you can mix the seeds with honey as a source of protein, as a food source for Indigenous people. So people are getting more interested in learning about Australian plants now and the different ways that you can use them, not just for aesthetic reasons in design, but also how you can use them in the kitchen or make tea or eat from them, or just the interesting side of cultural use of plants. This is a bottle brush. I'm sure you probably all know bottle brush. This is a white form of bottle brush, which is very pretty. Again, the bees love this plant, as do birds. So you can see the garden in its mature form, all Australian plants. And I love this photo because can you see the flower right at the base of this? This is a Banksia again, a Banksia marginata. So it's providing food source for ground foraging birds. Yeah, for those little birds that forage in amongst the twigs and the leaves on the ground. There's a food source right there for it. Isn't that just absolutely amazing? Now, this was another project I got involved with. This is the National Arboretum in Canberra. And through Charlie Solomon again, we were able to connect with the local Ngunnawal people, this is where the land where Canberra is, and Canberra is the capital of Australia. And there's an old Dreamtime story of the Ngunnawal people called Manunja the butterfly. And me reading into it, it's kind of like maybe a story of domestic violence, because there was a beautiful girl called Manunja, and there was a evil boy, because most boys are evil, aren't they, who fell in love with Manunja. But to protect Manunja from this evil boy, Manunja was turned into a beautiful butterfly. So every time they see a beautiful butterfly, they say, there is Manunja the butterfly. And it's quite a very old Dreamtime story. So I wanted to depict this Dreamtime story in a garden design at the National Arboretum in Canberra. And you can see I looked for inspiration from the wings of the butterfly to create the shapes of one of the wings of the butterfly, if that makes sense. And there's the overhead render of the design. And the spaces at the Arboretum had to also serve as entertainment spaces for weddings and things like that. So we had to have sort of broad areas for marquees as well. It's the commercial reality of creating gardens, as we all know. But you can see the shapes of the butterfly, the body of the butterfly here, and the fake eyes that you get on the wings of the butterfly, like so. I also wanted to represent the limestone plains out from Canberra, and this is all hand-seeded pebbling. It's quite a difficult technique, but used quite commonly, I think, all over the world now, isn't it? In England and things like that. And when the guys were seeding the paved areas, they sent me this photo. Can you see the butterfly? So as soon as I started building the garden, a butterfly arrived in the garden. It's a nice little side story. So I haven't been back since the launch of the garden. So obviously being a real garden, the plants were quite small at the time. But designed these seats inspired by butterfly wings, etc. And all the plants in the garden either provide a food source or a habitat for butterflies, or they had a strong cultural connection to the local Ngunnawal people. So the garden now serves as a living legacy to the Ngunnawal people, retelling this fantastic Dreamtime story to a whole new generation of children. There's the body of the butterfly, if you like, as a sort of a shade structure to sit in. You can see the garden here in the foreground. And again, I used some mounding just to create a bit of third dimension. It's only just planted in these photos, so you can't really see the plants very well. But the interesting thing here at the National Arboretum, so these are permanent gardens, and they built, I think, 7 or 8, they call it gallery of gardens. So each garden's a completely different theme with a completely different story, but it's a very interesting concept. And finally, I'll just show a couple of photos. This was a garden show in Sydney that I did a few years ago. This one was telling the story about the Australian soldiers in Gallipoli, and it was commemorating 100 years since the war in Gallipoli. So the idea was that I designed a very modern garden 100 years later, and the idea is that all the soldiers are represented by the Australian plants growing in the garden. And it was inspired by a poem, and the poem was written by a soldier because the Australian soldiers evacuated Gallipoli, and when they left, all their comrades were dead on the shores. But this poem was depicting how very quiet Gallipoli was as they evacuated, and it was just the sound of waves gently lapping on the beach and the wind rustling through the hillsides and the valleys of Gallipoli Peninsula. So I thought it'd be very evocative to use Australian plants to symbolise the soldiers who fell in Gallipoli. So the garden was planted to look like it was very wild and naturalistic, that it hadn't been planted by man at all. It was just plants growing over an old battlefield. You know, old trenches filled with gravel over time. The idea of an old dugout in the hillside where they'd sleep. As I say, the trenches and fire steps, but all Australian plants just growing very, very wild-like. And that brings me to the end. It's a great honour to be here in Moscow for the conference, and thank you very much for having me.
Спасибо большое. Есть ли вопросы к Джиму? Сейчас, секундочку.
Здравствуйте. Зоя Козичева. Вы показывали проект, где у вас полгода затопления, полгода жара и сухость. Скажите, пожалуйста, а средняя температура у вас какая вот, ну, когда идет затопление и когда идет жара? Температура воздуха. Или вот...
Okay, so in winter, the temperature would be a daytime temperature maybe 10 to 14 degrees Celsius, and in summer maybe from 18 degrees Celsius to 42 degrees type thing, yeah. But not cold like here. Yeah, no snow. It's very cold here.
Hi Jim. One of the things I've noticed since I've been in Russia is that a lot of people here seem to fight kind of native flora in terms of, you know, there's a rich plant life here, but what is seen to be out in the countryside or grows normally is almost perceived more as weeds, and there seems to be a real ambition to have more kind of planting that you'd find in Europe, you know, so in the summer you see lots of salvias and, you know, grasses and kind of really starting to replicate a lot of the perennial planting that happens in Europe. So, you know, what would your view be to Russian people in terms of their mentality towards plants here and things?
Yeah. And it's a good point, and it's very much the same in Australia, that people in the last say 30 years, people see Australian plants as a bit like weeds as well, and that, you know, they push back against them, and that's why they still look to European design as inspiration. But I think, and what I was talking about a bit today is, sometimes it's not just about the plants, but maybe there's cultural stories, significant stories about Russia and the history of Russia that also resonates in your heart, that can help form the basis of the inspiration for the design of a garden. So when you incorporate the background story combined with Russian plants, the outcome can be quite evocative.
You mentioned Cranbourne Botanic Gardens.
Yes.
Do you have anything to do with the design of it?
No, that was designed by Taylor Cullity Lethlean with Paul Thompson.
Thanks.
Yep.
I must say that I'm conflicted about some of the themes. Because, for example, Zaradia is a very good example of that conflict. How can it make sense to bring plants from different geographic regions into a singular region? Makes no sense at all. And I think, for example, if you take the steppe as a paradigm of Russian landscape, and you introduce aggressive grasses in a geographic region that is not suitable for that type of ecosystem, the story becomes extremely empty, and it becomes a sort of brand which supports tourism, ideas of homogenized nations, culture, and history. And I think this is not a good thing, because it's just simply introducing a quality into landscape which has nothing to do with the deep history of plants, landscape, and the relationship with people. And I think I sometimes feel very nervous when the things are packaged in this way.
Is that a statement or a question? But
for me, it is in Australia, it's particularly interesting because the settlers totally destroyed the Aborigines culture, the same like the settlers destroyed the Red Indian culture in America. And somehow there is a vacuum created, which I think requires a much more sophisticated approach based on real understanding of sustainability, environment, ecology. And it should not only be driven by aesthetics and culture, sentimentality.
Say okay.
Thank you for your contribution.
Еще? Ой, вот там вот в задних рядах, да, тоже потом.
Someone in the back wants to ask a question. Good morning. Well, in one of the images of your garden, in the foreground, I saw a Durbanic, which is a plant that we see in the wildlife, in wet places. We love using it in our garden designs. So I was just wondering whether you ran into any problems in using this plant and whether you meet it in wildlife. Is it a native plant or is it an imported plant?
Yeah, I think I know the one you mean. It's got the mauvey flower, yeah? The pinky, Lythrum, yes. And yeah, it's interesting actually you raise that because there was conjecture in Australia for many years as to whether it was native or introduced. And they've actually DNA tested 2,000 years. So it's now been classified as an Australian native. As well, I know it grows in Europe and North America as well, but yeah. So that plant, I've only used it on that project because it can get a bit weedy. So I'd be very careful where I use it. But I find in this situation, it's been absolutely fantastic because it does tolerate the wet periods. But also, again, it provides, you know, the butterflies love it. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Спасибо.
Good morning. I'll try to summarize all of the above because most of the questions that I wanted to ask have already been asked by the previous speakers. Well, I'd like to disagree. I beg to disagree that regional features cannot be used in the landscape design. That contradicts the very essence of landscape design. Landscape design is about establishing the link between people and the nature. And what if you were born in a specific region? If you love your region, why are you saying that he or she should not know the native plants that grow there? I believe that landscape design, the task of the landscape design is to bring everything together to tell a person a story about the local land. And now I'll try to phrase the question. There are certain plants that are similar. Well, the names are different in different countries. The species might be different. There might be hybrids. So my question is, do you use wildlife plants in your designs, or do you use plants that you get from the nurseries? Because those designs that tell a story about Australian culture, can they be actually called such stories if you use plants from a nursery as opposed to wildlife?
I'm not sure I understand the question. The big challenge we have in Australia is a lot of nurseries grow for commercial purposes, which is understandable. And often the plants they are offering to the marketplace are different to what designers are trying to look for nowadays. So I think designers are looking for plants that will provide food for fauna, whereas nurseries are really growing more for what will sell the most, which are two different things. You look as confused as I am. Does that answer the question? No.
Well, partially, I would say. So, some landscape designers in Russia, and I know it for a fact, like to dig out some flower from the woodland and use it in their project, and they just say, there is no doubt that this is a Russian-style project, just because I used a flower from the wildlife. Did you use solutions like that?
No, because that's destroying habitat. Yeah, so, and there's lots of strict laws in place. You can't just go into a forest and take plants out for your garden, no, it's a big no-no. And there's some big fines, actually, very well protected. Some of the grass trees in particular are worth a lot of money, and they can be hundreds of years old, and there's big issues with people stealing them from the wilderness. And it's very bad. Yeah, so we're very against that.
So don't do this. Actually, it is prohibited by Russian law as well. Did you want to ask a question too? Good morning. My question is as follows. You touched upon a very interesting point, which is the role of a garden within a larger ecosystem. So my question is, how can we sell this idea to the end customer? And by the end customer, I mean the owner of the garden or a private developer. Because in Russia, oftentimes it's difficult to promote and sell such ideas. What would your advice be?
Well, I think that's where things like Moscow Flower Jam serve a really important role because it provides an opportunity for landscape designers, landscape architects to help educate or raise awareness or maybe inspire other people as to topics like this. And it gives you the opportunity to research or reinterpret some Russian history or historical stories in garden design that helps to keep that story alive for new generations. And one thing I'm quite passionate about at home is the ability to educate children. I've got 2 daughters myself, so I'm quite familiar with the importance of and the ability to help children understand the role that plants play in the wider cycle of life. That birds feed off the flowers; they need that food source. That butterflies feed off flowers. That plants reproduce. That vegetables come from the garden. All those basics that we all are familiar with, but not everyone is, and we can't assume they are. So, I think that's where, as I say, garden shows serve a very important role in raising those issues and helping to inspire other people as to those issues.
Спасибо большое. У вас позже будет еще...
Thank you so much. Later on, you will have a chance to address your questions to Jim during the break, for instance. Jim, please do not go away. I'm going to pass on the floor to Margarita for a second. Ladies and gentlemen, let me share some news with you. I'd like to introduce to you the chair of the Board of Jury of Flower Jam 2020 to you. Well, judging by your reaction and judging by my reaction, Jim, I guess following your presentation, it's quite clear that we were right in selecting you as the chair of the jury board. You are amazing. Your attitude towards the native history, the native culture, and the traditions of Australia just goes to show everyone that the mission of the Flower Jam is really relevant and important. We try to drive the following message home when we talk to the participants in the Flower Jam contest. Your garden designs should promote our traditions and our respect to the culture and the plants. I do understand that 70% of the garden plants were imported from Germany and the Netherlands, but nevertheless, developing the national nurseries is important. Our nurseries are quite young. Well, Jim, we might brief you on the history of Russia later on, and you will better understand how come we didn't have any nurseries for 70 years, for the past 70 years. Irina Savatieva is head of the head of one of the tree nurseries. Indeed, we cannot dig out trees out of the woodlands, but we can grow them in our nurseries. However, nurseries have recently been started, and Europe is closer to Russia than Australia, both geographically and culturally. But I still believe that your presentation was a real revelation for the finalists, and well, I'd like to ask Jim to say a few words about his upcoming job as the chair of the jury board, and I hope that Andy, as the chair, as the last year's chair, and Matthew Childs as the chair of the previous years would share their experience with you and brief you on the traditions of the Flower Jam contest. I really hope that this job will incentivize Jim to study Russian culture at least partially. I believe that it's quite interesting, and we're going to assist you in any way we can.
Spasibo. I think I'm hoping that Matthew and Andy will share some of their time with me, maybe over a vodka, and discuss the challenges of being the jury chair. But I am genuinely very, very honoured, and I'm very excited and curious to learn more about Russian culture and how that shows through the amazing designs that I've seen here in Russia. So I'm very excited. The entries look amazing, and if they're anything like this year's exhibits, I was very impressed by them. So I think it's an incredible thing that you're doing, and I'm very honoured, but I absolutely applaud all of you for being part of this. Thank you. Spasibo.
Thank you so much, Jim. And seeing the success of the presentation you just delivered and giving so many questions, and unfortunately we were unable to take all of them because we're on a tight schedule, but nevertheless, I hope that during your upcoming visit, we will be able to organize some workshops for the students and for the contestants, because I really believe that you inspired everyone by your personal experience. Thank you so much.